The blood-soaked dirt slipped through Daniel Dawson's fingers. As he lowered his sister's body into the shallow grave he'd spent hours digging in the hills overlooking Tucson, Arizona territory. The year was 1877, and the West was as wild as the stories told back east, though none of those tales had prepared him for burying his own flesh and blood under a scorching desert sun. "You'll visit together someday, Danny," she had whispered just before drawing her final breath at dawn. "Just not yet." Her words haunted him as he packed the earth over her still form. Rebecca had always been the mystic of the family, seeing things before they happened, speaking in riddles that only made sense when it was too late. Their pa had called it nonsense, but Daniel had witnessed too many of her predictions come true to dismiss them. A lone tear tracked through the dust on his cheek as he placed a crude wooden cross at the head of the grave. Rebecca Dawson, 26 years old. Taken by the same fever that had claimed their parents back in Missouri 5 years ago. All that remained of his family now lay beneath the red soil of the Tucson Mountains. The wind picked up, sending his hat tumbling down the slope. Daniel let it go, his thoughts too heavy with grief to care about the sun beating down on his exposed head. His sister had been the reason he'd come west in the first place, trailing after her when she'd set off to make a new life for herself as a schoolteacher in this dusty frontier town. Now he was alone, a 28-year-old ranch hand with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse that wasn't even his own. "I promise I'll come back," he murmured to the fresh grave. "I don't know what you meant about visiting together, but I won't leave you alone out here forever." The ride back to Tucson was long and silent, the endless expanse of desert scrub and saguaro offering no comfort. By the time Daniel reached the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning to dip behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. He returned the borrowed horse to the livery stable, nodded his thanks to the sympathetic stable master, and made his way toward the boarding house where he'd been staying since arriving in town 3 months prior. He paused outside the Rusty Nail Saloon, the sounds of piano music and raucous laughter spilling out onto the street. Grief and loneliness pushed him through the swinging doors before he could think better of it. He wasn't much of a drinking man, but tonight seemed as good a time as any to start. The saloon was crowded with the usual evening patrons, ranch hands, miners, and drifters looking to wash away the desert dust with whiskey and conversation. Daniel made his way to the bar and ordered a drink, keeping his eyes fixed on the scarred wooden surface before him. "You look like you've seen the devil himself," a female voice observed from his right. Daniel turned to find a woman watching him with keen hazel eyes. She wasn't one of the saloon girls. Her dress was simple and practical, though not without a certain elegance. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a sensible bun, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. "Something like that," he replied, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. "Grace Callahan," she introduced herself, extending a gloved hand. "I run the general store down the street." Daniel took her hand briefly. "Daniel Dawson, you're Rebecca's brother," she said, recognition lighting her features. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your sister was a wonderful woman. The children adored her." The mention of Rebecca sent a fresh wave of pain through him. "Thank you," he managed. "Did you know her well? As well as anyone in town, I suppose," Grace replied. "She came into the store often. We would talk about books and the children she taught. She spoke of you frequently after you arrived." Daniel took a deep drink of his whiskey, welcoming the burn in his throat. "I buried her today, up in the hills," Grace's expression softened. "I heard I wanted to come, but it was just me," Daniel cut her off. "It's how she would have wanted it." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Daniel signaled for another drink. "Mr. Dawson," Grace said carefully, "forgive my intrusion, but what will you do now?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought beyond this moment, beyond the crushing weight of having put his sister in the ground. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been working at the Carson Ranch, but I took the job to be near Rebecca. Now, there's nothing keeping you in Tucson," Grace finished for him. "Nothing at all." Grace seemed to consider something. "I could use some help at the store. My father passed last year and I've been managing on my own. The stock needs organizing, deliveries need to be made. It's not glamorous work, but it pays. Daniel studied her face, trying to understand why this stranger would offer him employment. Why would you do that? Your sister was kind to me when I first reopened the store after my father died, Grace explained. She helped me balance the books and spread the word among the townsfolk. I'm simply returning a favor. I don't need charity, Miss Callahan. It's not charity, Mr. Dawson. It's a job offering. You look strong, and I need someone who can lift crates and handle deliveries. The fact that you're Rebecca's brother just means I'm more inclined to trust you than some drifter passing through. Daniel finished his second whiskey, considering her offer. The Carson Ranch was a good 3 hours' ride from town. He'd only been able to visit Rebecca on Sundays and the occasional evening when he could get away. If he took this job in town, he could visit her grave more often. I'll think about it, he finally said. Grace nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. The offer stands. I open at 7 each morning. She rose from her seat. Good night, Mr. Dawson, and again, I am truly sorry about Rebecca. Daniel watched her leave, a slender figure moving with purpose through the crowd of rowdy men. When she was gone, he ordered another whiskey and tried to make sense of a world without his sister in it. Morning came with a pounding headache and the realization that he had nowhere to be. Daniel had spent the night tossing and turning in his rented room, dreams of Rebecca's final moments intruding whenever he managed to drift off. By dawn, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands and wondering what purpose they would serve now. After washing his face in the basin of cold water, Daniel dressed and stepped out into the early morning light. The streets of Tucson were beginning to stir, shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts, wagons rolling in with supplies, and the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery down the street. His feet carried him without conscious direction until he found himself standing outside Callahan's general store. Through the window, he could see Grace moving about, arranging items on shelves and checking a ledger. Something about her methodical movements reminded him of Rebecca, the same purposeful efficiency, the same quiet determination. Before he could change his mind, Daniel pushed open the door, the bell above it announcing his arrival. Grace looked up, surprise evident on her face. Mr. Dawson. Good morning. That job offer, he said without preamble, is it still available? A small smile curved her lips. It is. Are you accepting? Yes, he replied, the decision feeling right somehow. I don't know much about store keeping, but I'm a quick learner. Excellent, Grace said, closing her ledger. We can discuss the details over coffee. I was just about to make some. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Daniel learned the workings of the general store. Grace was a patient teacher, showing him how to organize inventory, handle transactions, and deal with the various personalities that made up Tucson's population. The work was different from anything he'd done before, less physically demanding than ranch work, but requiring more attention to detail and interpersonal skills. Every Sunday, Daniel rode up to the hills to visit Rebecca's grave, sometimes bringing wildflowers he'd gathered along the way. He would sit beside the wooden cross and talk to her, telling her about his new job, about Grace, about the town gossip he'd overheard at the store. She's a good woman, Becca, he said one Sunday in late April, the desert beginning to bloom with spring flowers. Reminds me of you in some ways. Stubborn as a mule, smart as a whip. She's teaching me to read better, did I tell you? Says a man running a store ought to be able to read invoices without stumbling over every other word. The wind rustled through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. Daniel imagined it was Rebecca's way of responding. I don't know what you meant about visiting together, he continued, but I'm keeping my promise to come back. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel found himself settling into a routine in Tucson. The raw wound of Rebecca's death began to heal, though the scar remained. Grace's steady presence in his life became a comfort he hadn't expected, her quiet strength a balm to his grief. One evening in June, as they were closing the store, Grace surprised him with a question. Would you join me for supper at my home tonight, Mr. Dawson? I've made more stew than one person can eat, and it seems a shame to waste it. Daniel was taken aback by the invitation. Though they had shared midday meals at the store, they had maintained a strictly professional relationship otherwise. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said hesitantly. "It's not an imposition if I'm inviting you," Grace pointed out with a small smile. "Besides, I'd like to hear more about your time on the Carson Ranch. I'm considering ordering some of their beef for the store." It was a transparent excuse, but Daniel appreciated the effort to frame the invitation in business terms. "In that case, I'd be honored." Grace's home was a modest adobe structure on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a small garden that somehow thrived in the desert climate. Inside, the house was simply but comfortably furnished, with bookshelves lining one wall, a luxury in the territory. "You have quite a collection," Daniel observed, running his finger along the spines of the books. "My father was an educated man," Grace explained as she ladled stew into bowls. "He believed knowledge was the most valuable commodity, even out here where most people are more concerned with gold and cattle." They ate at a small table by the window, the conversation flowing more easily than Daniel had expected. Grace told him about growing up in Tucson, how her father had come west during the gold rush, but had seen more opportunity in supplying miners than in mining himself. Daniel shared stories of his childhood in Missouri, of Rebecca's uncanny ability to predict storms, and of their journey west after their parents' deaths. "She sounds remarkable," Grace said softly. "I wish I had known her better." "She would have liked you," Daniel replied, surprised to find he could speak of Rebecca now without his throat closing up. "She always said she could tell a person's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them." Grace tilted her head. "And how did I measure up in her estimation?" She said you were one of the good ones, that you gave credit to families down on their luck and hired the half-Mexican boy to deliver parcels when no one else would. A blush colored Grace's cheeks. "It's just good business to help your customers through hard times, and Miguel is the fastest delivery boy I've ever had." "Rebecca saw through that kind of modesty," Daniel said with a smile. "So do I." Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted in the air between them. Daniel suddenly became aware of how the sunset light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, how her hazel eyes seemed to hold both strength and vulnerability. The moment was broken by the distant howl of a coyote. Grace stood, clearing their empty bowls. "Would you like coffee?" "I should probably be going," Daniel said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for supper, it was delicious." "Any time," Grace replied, walking him to the door. "Thank you for the company." As Daniel made his way back to his boarding house under the star-filled desert sky, he found himself thinking not of Rebecca and his loss, but of Grace and the possibility of something new. Summer in the Arizona Territory was brutal, the heat shimmering off the dusty streets of Tucson, turning the town into an oven. Business at the store slowed during the hottest part of the day, with most customers coming early in the morning or after sunset when the temperatures were more bearable. During one particularly scorching afternoon in July, when even the flies seemed too lethargic to buzz, Daniel and Grace sat in the relative cool of the store's back room, going through the monthly accounts. "We're doing better than I expected," Grace remarked, reviewing the figures in her neat handwriting. "Your idea to stock more preserves was a good one. They're selling faster than we can get them in." "People get tired of beans and jerky," Daniel said with a shrug. "A little sweetness goes a long way out here." Grace looked up from her ledger, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You've been good for this store, Daniel, for me too." Over the months, they had gradually transitioned from Mr. Dawson and Miss Callahan to their given names, though only when they were alone. The change felt significant somehow, a marker of their evolving relationship. "I should be thanking you," Daniel replied. "You gave me a purpose when I had none." "Is that why you've stayed? Because of the store?" There was something vulnerable in her question, a hint of something more. Daniel considered his answer carefully. "At first, yes, it was somewhere to be, something to do. And it kept me close to Rebecca's grave." He paused, meeting her gaze. "But now, there are other reasons." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Grace's cheeks colored slightly as she looked back down at her ledger. "I'm glad," she said simply. That evening, as they were closing the store, a commotion in the street drew their attention. A group of riders was thundering into town, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. At their center, a man slumped over his saddle, his shirt darkened with what could only be blood. "Doctor." One of the riders shouted. "We need the doctor." Daniel hurried outside, recognizing the wounded man as one of the hands from the Carson ranch. "What happened?" he asked, helping to steady the injured cowboy. "Apache raid," one of the other riders explained grimly. "Hit the south pasture." Frank took an arrow in the shoulder. "Dr. Morris is 2 doors down," Grace said, appearing at Daniel's side. "Take him there, I'll fetch some bandages from the store." As the men carried their wounded companion toward the doctor's office, Daniel turned to Grace. "I should go with them." "I know those men," she nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Go, I'll close up here." The next few hours were chaotic as more riders arrived with news of the attack. The ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Hank Porter, confirmed that a small band of Apaches had raided the cattle herd, making off with a dozen head and wounding 2 ranch hands in the process. "Sheriff's putting together a posse to go after them," Hank informed the group gathered outside the doctor's office. "Anyone willing to ride out at first light should meet at the jail." Daniel felt a familiar restlessness stir in him, the old need to be doing something, to be in motion. "I'll go," he volunteered. Hank gave him a nod of approval. "Glad to have you, Dawson. You know the land." When Daniel returned to the store to inform Grace of his decision, he found her waiting, a concerned expression on her face. "You're going with the posse," she said before he could speak. "It wasn't a question." "I know those hills better than most," he explained. "I can help track them." Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's dangerous, Daniel. The Apaches know that territory better than any white man." "I have to go, Grace. These are people I worked with. And if the Apaches continue raiding, it puts everyone at risk, including the town." She stepped closer, her hand reaching out to straighten his collar in a surprisingly intimate gesture. "Then you'd better come back in one piece, Daniel Dawson. I have plans for this store and they include you." The simple touch and her words sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. "Is that a fact?" "It is," she replied, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. "So be careful." "I will," he promised, catching her hand in his. For a moment they stood there, connected by their joined hands and the weight of words not yet spoken. The posse set out at dawn, a group of 12 men led by Sheriff Thomas Wilson, an experienced lawman who had been tracking renegade Apaches for years. Daniel rode his mare, Sadie, a steady mount he had purchased with his earnings from the store. The familiar weight of his Winchester rifle across his saddle was both comforting and unsettling, a reminder of a life he had begun to leave behind. They followed the trail south, toward the mountains where the Apaches were likely headed. The land grew rougher as they rode, the flat desert giving way to rocky foothills and narrow canyons. By midday, the heat was oppressive, the men conserving their water and speaking little. "Tracks split here," Sheriff Wilson announced as they reached a dry creek bed. "Looks like they're trying to throw us off. We'll need to divide up." Daniel was assigned to a group of 4 men who would follow the eastern trail. As they separated from the main posse, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as they navigated a narrow ravine, the walls rising steeply on either side. "I don't like this," muttered one of the other men, a rancher named Ellis. "Perfect place for an ambush." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the air was split by war cries from above. Apache warriors appeared on the ridge, raining arrows down on the trapped posse members. Daniel's mare reared as an arrow struck the ground nearby. He fought to control her while drawing his pistol. "Take cover," he shouted, guiding Sadie toward a cluster of boulders. The next few minutes were chaos, gunshots echoing off the canyon walls, the screams of wounded men and horses, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Daniel managed to get off several shots, but the Apaches had the advantage of height and cover. A sharp pain lanced through his side as an arrow grazed him, tearing his shirt and leaving a burning trail along his ribs. He pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the warm wetness of blood seeping through his fingers. Ellis wasn't so lucky. An arrow caught him squarely in the chest, and he fell from his horse with a gurgling cry that Daniel knew meant the wound was fatal. The other 2 men in their group were firing wildly, panic making their shots go wide. "We need to retreat," Daniel called to them. "Get out of this ravine." They needed no further urging, wheeling their horses around and galloping back the way they had come. Daniel followed, keeping low in the saddle and ignoring the pain in his side. Arrows continued to fall around them, but the shots became less accurate as they increased the distance. By the time they rejoined the rest of the posse, Ellis was dead, another man was wounded in the arm, and Daniel's side was bleeding freely. Sheriff Wilson took one look at their condition and made the decision to return to Tucson. "The Apaches have the advantage out here," he said grimly. "We've lost 1 man already, no sense losing more." The ride back to town was slow and somber, the wounded men setting the pace. Daniel's wound, while painful, wasn't deep, but by the time they reached Tucson late that evening, he was light-headed from blood loss and the day's exertion. Word of the posse's return spread quickly through town. As they rode down the main street, people emerged from buildings to witness their arrival. Daniel spotted Grace standing outside the store, her face pale with worry as she scanned the returning riders. When their eyes met, relief washed over her features, quickly replaced by concern as she noticed his bloodied shirt. She pushed through the gathering crowd to reach him as he dismounted. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight. "It's just a scratch," Daniel assured her, though the world swayed alarmingly as his feet hit the ground. Grace slipped her arm around his waist, supporting him. "A scratch that's bled half through your shirt. Come inside." The store was closed, but Grace led him through to the back room where she kept a medical kit. She made him sit on a chair and carefully helped him remove his shirt to examine the wound. "You're lucky," she said after cleaning away the blood. "It's not deep, but it needs stitching." She looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "Ellis didn't make it back," Daniel nodded grimly. "Arrow to the chest. There was nothing we could do." Grace worked in silence for a moment, gathering supplies to tend his wound. "I was afraid," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I heard the posse was returning with casualties, I thought, 'I'm here,'" Daniel said, reaching out to touch her cheek. "I came back." Her eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away, focusing on the task at hand. With gentle efficiency, she cleaned his wound, applied a poultice of herbs, and began to stitch the gash closed. Daniel winced at the first prick of the needle but remained still, watching her face as she worked. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed into a determined line. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, partly to distract himself from the pain. "My father," Grace replied, her hands never faltering. "He said a woman alone in the territory needed to know how to handle everything from bookkeeping to bullet wounds. Wise man." "He was," she agreed, tying off the last stitch. She sat back, examining her handiwork. "That should hold. You'll need to keep it clean and change the bandage daily." "Thank you," Daniel said, catching her hand as she began to pack away her supplies. "Not just for this, for waiting, for worrying." Grace's expression softened. "Of course I worried. She stopped, seeming to struggle with what to say next. Daniel didn't let go of her hand. "You what?" She met his gaze, a new resolve in her eyes. "I care for you, Daniel, more than I should, perhaps, as your employer." "I care for you too," he replied, his voice low, "more than is proper for your employee." The space between them seemed to disappear as they leaned toward each other. Daniel's free hand found its way to Grace's cheek, cradling it gently as their lips met in a tentative kiss. It was brief and sweet, a promise of something more. When they separated, Grace's cheeks were flushed, but her eyes were clear and certain. "You should rest," she said practically, though her voice had a breathless quality to it. "That wound needs time to heal." Daniel reluctantly agreed, knowing she was right. But as she helped him put on a clean shirt she had retrieved from the store's inventory, he couldn't help but feel that something fundamental had shifted between them. The boundary of employer and employee had been crossed, revealing the deeper connection that had been building for months. "I'll see you tomorrow," Grace said as she walked him to the door. "Don't strain that side." "Yes, madam," he replied with a small smile, touching his hat in a gesture that was both teasing and respectful. As he made his way back to his boarding house under the star-filled Arizona sky, the pain in his side was overshadowed by the memory of Grace's lips on his, and the promise of what tomorrow might bring. The Apache raids continued sporadically throughout the late summer, keeping the territory on edge. The Army sent additional troops to patrol the area around Tucson, and ranchers organized their own security measures. At the store, business remained steady as people stocked up on supplies, uncertain of what the coming weeks might bring. Daniel's wound healed well under Grace's care, leaving only a thin scar along his ribs. Their relationship, however, blossomed in unexpected ways. What had begun as a simple kiss had grown into something deeper, their professional partnership evolving into a courtship that was the subject of much good-natured gossip in Tucson. On Sundays, they would ride together to Rebecca's grave in the hills. Grace would bring flowers while Daniel cleared away any debris that had accumulated around the wooden cross. They would sit there for a time, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories about Rebecca. "She would have approved of you," Daniel told Grace on one such visit in early September, as they sat side by side looking out over the valley below. "She always wanted me to find someone who could match my stubborn streak." Grace laughed, the sound bright in the quiet of the hillside. "And have I matched it? Exceeded it, I'd say," Daniel replied with a grin, taking her gloved hand in his. "She told me about you, you know," Grace said after a moment. "Before you came to Tucson, she showed me a photograph and said her brother was the most loyal man she'd ever known. Said if I ever needed someone I could trust completely, it would be you." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. "She never mentioned that. I think she was playing matchmaker from afar," Grace mused. "She had that look in her eye, the one people get when they're plotting something they think is for your own good." "That sounds like Rebecca," Daniel agreed, remembering his sister's tendency to meddle in what she considered the best interests of those she loved. A memory surfaced, something Rebecca had said during one of his visits to town before she fell ill. "You should come by the general store sometime. Miss Callahan has the finest selection of books this side of Tucson, and the prettiest eyes, too." He shared the memory with Grace, who blushed prettily. "She invited me to Sunday dinner once, said she had someone she wanted me to meet. But then she fell ill and—" They fell silent, both contemplating how Rebecca had tried to bring them together in life only to succeed in death. It was a bittersweet realization. "You'll visit together someday," Daniel murmured, repeating his sister's final words. "Just not yet." Grace looked at him questioningly. "Something she said before she died," he explained. "I think she knew somehow that I'd find you, that we'd come here together." "Your sister had the sight," Grace said, not as a question but as an acceptance of something she had come to understand about Rebecca. "Pa called it nonsense, but yes, I believe she did." Daniel squeezed Grace's hand, "And I'm grateful for it if it helped lead me to you." As autumn approached, bringing milder temperatures to the territory, Daniel found himself contemplating a future he hadn't dared imagine after Rebecca's death. His position at the store had become more than just employment. He was now effectively Grace's partner in the business, handling negotiations with suppliers, making decisions about inventory, and even expanding their services to include deliveries to outlying ranches. But it was his personal relationship with Grace that occupied his thoughts most frequently. They had settled into a comfortable routine, taking evening meals together several times a week, attending church on Sundays, and enjoying quiet conversations on her porch as the desert cooled after sunset. Yet Daniel found himself wanting more, dreaming of a life where they shared not just their days but their nights as well, where the store was truly their joint venture, where perhaps someday children might run among the shelves and barrels. The opportunity to express these feelings came unexpectedly one October evening. A traveling photographer had set up his equipment in the town square, offering portraits to the citizens of Tucson. On a whim, Daniel suggested they have their photograph taken together. For the store, he explained. To show customers the proprietors. Grace agreed with an amused smile, clearly seeing through his flimsy pretext. They posed together in front of the photographer's painted backdrop of a grand parlor, standing closer than was strictly proper but not scandalously so. Grace wore her best dress, a deep blue cotton with lace at the collar, while Daniel had donned his Sunday suit and actually polished his boots for the occasion. Hold very still, the photographer instructed from beneath his black cloth. This will take several seconds. As they stood frozen in place, waiting for the exposure to complete, Daniel murmured from the corner of his mouth, "Marry me, Grace." He felt her stiffen slightly beside him, though her expression remained fixed for the camera. "What did you say?" she whispered back, her lips barely moving. "I said marry me," Daniel repeated, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would ruin the photograph. "Excellent," the photographer declared, emerging from behind his equipment. "A fine portrait it will be. Next." As they moved away from the backdrop, Grace pulled Daniel to a quiet corner of the square, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, hope, perhaps. "Did you mean that?" she asked. "Or was it just something to say to pass the time while we stood there?" Daniel took both her hands in his, propriety be damned. "I've never meant anything more in my life, Grace Callahan. I love you. I want to spend my days with you, build a life with you. Will you have me as your husband?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Daniel Dawson." Relief and joy washed over him. He wanted nothing more than to kiss her right there in the town square, but he settled for bringing her hands to his lips instead, mindful of the public setting. "When?" he asked. "Before winter," she replied without hesitation. "I see no reason to wait when we both know our minds." They were married on the first Sunday in November in the small wooden church that served Tucson's Protestant congregation. The ceremony was simple but well attended. In the months since Rebecca's death, Daniel had become a respected member of the community, and Grace had lived in Tucson her entire life. Sheriff Wilson stood as Daniel's best man, while Grace was attended by the wife of the town's banker, a close friend since childhood. Daniel wore a new suit ordered specially from a tailor in Phoenix, and Grace stunned him in a cream-colored dress with pearl buttons that had once belonged to her mother. As they exchanged vows before the pastor and their friends, Daniel felt a sense of rightness, as if all the paths of his life had been leading to this moment. The celebration afterward was held at the Rusty Nail Saloon, which the owner had closed to regular business for the occasion. There was music from a fiddle player who worked at the livery stable, plenty of food prepared by the women of the church, and enough whiskey to ensure the dancing grew more enthusiastic as the evening progressed. As Daniel and Grace moved around the room, accepting congratulations and good wishes, he noticed a strange expression cross his new wife's face when they approached an older woman who had been Grace's neighbor for years. "What is it?" he asked when they had moved on. "Mrs. Abernathy just told me that she saw Rebecca at our wedding," Grace replied quietly, her brow furrowed. "Said she was standing at the back of the church, watching the ceremony with a smile on her face." Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "Rebecca's gone, Grace." "I know," she assured him. "Mrs. Abernathy is getting on in years, and her eyesight isn't what it was. She probably saw someone who reminded her of Rebecca." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps his sister had found a way to be present after all, to witness the happiness she had tried to orchestrate before her death. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. Later that night, as they entered the house that was now theirs together, Grace had insisted they live in her home rather than Daniel's rented room. He shared his thoughts with her. "Do you think it's possible that Rebecca was somehow there?" Grace considered the question seriously as she removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall in auburn waves down her back. "I believe there are more things in heaven and earth than we can explain, Daniel. Your sister had gifts that defied understanding." If anyone could find a way to be present for something so important to you, it would be Rebecca. Her acceptance of the possibility, without judgment or disbelief, was yet another reason Daniel loved her. Grace's practicality was balanced by an open mind, a willingness to accept that the world held mysteries beyond human comprehension. "You'll visit together someday, just not yet," he murmured, remembering again his sister's final words. I wonder what she meant. Grace came to him then, placing her hands on his chest and looking up into his eyes. "Perhaps she meant that one day, far in the future, when we've lived full lives together, we'll join her, but not yet, not when we have so much living still to do." Daniel pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "I like your interpretation better than any I've come up with." "Good," she said with a smile that held both innocence and promise. "Now, Mr. Dawson, I believe we have more pressing matters to attend to than ghost stories." Their life together fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. They worked side by side at the store during the day, expanded their inventory to include more luxury items as Tucson grew, and enjoyed their evenings in the comfort of their home. Daniel continued to visit Rebecca's grave regularly, sometimes alone and sometimes with Grace, keeping the area tidy and replacing the wooden cross with a proper headstone once their business had prospered enough to afford such an expense. The Apache raids gradually decreased as the government negotiated treaties and established reservations. Tucson expanded, with new businesses opening along the main street and more families settling in the area. The Arizona Territory was changing, becoming more civilized with each passing year, though it still retained much of the rugged character that had drawn people west in the first place. In the spring of 1879, a year and a half after Rebecca's death, Grace announced that she was with child. The news filled Daniel with a joy he hadn't thought possible, as well as a nervous anticipation at the prospect of fatherhood. "What if I'm no good at it?" he fretted one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "My own pa was often absent, working the fields from dawn till dusk. I hardly knew him." Grace took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. "You'll be a wonderful father, Daniel. You're kind and patient and steady, all the things a child needs, and you won't be alone. We'll figure it out together." Her confidence in him was like a balm, soothing his fears even as it humbled him. Daniel had never considered himself a lucky man, not when he'd lost his parents to fever, not when he'd had to bury his sister in foreign soil. But now, sitting beside his wife on the porch of their home, with the promise of new life growing within her, he knew he had been blessed beyond measure. The pregnancy progressed well, with Grace maintaining her health despite the summer heat. She continued to work at the store, though Daniel insisted she take more frequent rests and leave the heavy lifting to him. By autumn, her condition was evident to everyone, and the women of Tucson showered her with advice, remedies, and hand-knitted baby clothes. Daniel found himself building a cradle in the evenings, carefully shaping the wood and sanding it smooth until not a splinter remained that might harm his child. Grace watched him work, her sewing in her lap, occasionally offering suggestions or simply admiring his handiwork. "I think Rebecca knew about this too," she said one night as Daniel was applying a coat of varnish to the finished cradle. "About the baby." Daniel looked up, curious. "What makes you say that?" Remember the quilt she was working on before she fell ill, the one with the tiny stars all over it. He nodded, recalling the project his sister had been so secretive about. "She said it was a surprise for someone special. She left it with Mrs. Abernathy, asked her to give it to me on my wedding day. I thought it was just a gift, a blessing for our marriage." Grace stroked her rounded belly. "But it's the perfect size for a baby's bed, too small for anything else, really." Daniel set down his brush, considering the implications. "So you think even then she knew we would marry and have a child?" "I think she saw possibilities," Grace replied thoughtfully. "Paths that might unfold if certain choices were made. And she did what she could to guide us toward happiness." The idea brought comfort rather than unease now, the thought that Rebecca had seen this joy in their future and had done what she could to ensure it came to pass. even knowing she wouldn't be there to witness it herself. Their son was born on a cold December night, with snow dusting the desert for the first time in years, a rare sight in Tucson. After hours of labor that left Daniel pacing anxiously outside their bedroom while the midwife attended Grace, the lusty cries of a newborn filled the house. When he was finally allowed in, Daniel found Grace propped up against pillows, tired but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in Rebecca's star quilt. "Come meet your son," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Thomas Daniel Dawson." Daniel approached the bed cautiously, almost afraid that any sudden movement might somehow harm the tiny person who had entered their lives. When Grace placed the baby in his arms, he felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Thomas had a shock of dark hair like Daniel's, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they seemed to be the same hazel as Grace's. His tiny fingers curled reflexively around Daniel's thumb, a grip so small yet so determined that it felt like a promise. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered, afraid to speak louder and disturb the miracle in his arms. "He is," Grace agreed, her eyes filled with happy tears, "and he's ours." As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Thomas grew and thrived. He was a cheerful baby with his mother's curiosity and his father's steady temperament. Daniel discovered depths of patience he hadn't known he possessed as he walked the floor with his son during colicky nights or sang off key lullabies that nonetheless seemed to soothe the infant. They adjusted the store's operations to accommodate their new family, creating a small nursery in the back room where Thomas could nap while they worked. Customers grew accustomed to seeing the baby propped in a basket on the counter, watching the goings-on with wide, interested eyes. On a Sunday in July, when Thomas was 7 months old, they made the journey to Rebecca's grave. It was the first time they had brought the baby with them, and Daniel felt a strange mixture of sadness and pride as he carried his son up the hillside. The headstone gleamed in the sunlight, the inscription simple: Rebecca Dawson, beloved sister and friend, 1851–1877. Daniel had added a small carving of a star at the bottom, a tribute to her final gift to his son. "This is your Aunt Rebecca," Daniel told Thomas, who was contentedly chewing on his fist. "She would have loved you very much." Grace spread a blanket on the ground, and they sat together in the shade of a mesquite tree, enjoying a small picnic while a breeze carried the scent of desert blooms around them. Thomas practiced sitting up, occasionally toppling over but always with a giggle rather than a cry. As they gathered their things to leave, Daniel placed a hand on the headstone, a gesture that had become ritual for him. "We're happy, Becca," he said softly. "I hope you can see that wherever you are." The wind picked up suddenly, rustling through the mesquite leaves with a sound almost like laughter. Thomas looked up at the swaying branches, his face breaking into a delighted smile as he reached toward the dancing shadows. "He's looking at something," Grace observed. "Something that makes him happy." Daniel followed his son's gaze but saw nothing unusual, yet Thomas continued to smile and reach upward, as if trying to touch something or someone just beyond his grasp. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, not of fear but of recognition. "Do you think he can see her?" Grace watched her son's delighted face, his eyes tracking something invisible to adult perception. "Perhaps. They say babies can see things we can't, that they're still close enough to where they came from to perceive what's beyond our understanding." Daniel wasn't sure if he believed that, but as Thomas laughed at nothing they could see, he found himself hoping it was true that somehow his sister was present, watching over her nephew, sharing in their joy even if they couldn't perceive her. As they rode back to town, Thomas securely held in Grace's arms, Daniel felt a sense of completion he had never expected to find after burying Rebecca. The raw wound of her loss had healed into a scar that would always be part of him but no longer defined him. In its place was a life fuller than he could have imagined, a wife he adored, a son who brought daily joy, a business that supported them comfortably, and a community that had become home. Years passed, bringing changes both personal and to the territory around them. Thomas grew from a baby to a boy with his father's quiet strength, and his mother's quick intelligence. The store expanded, adding a second story that served as a lending library, Grace's dream come true. Tucson itself grew as the railroad arrived, bringing new settlers, more commerce, and increasing civilization to what had once been the wild frontier. In 1883, their daughter Rebecca Grace was born, named for the aunt she would never meet and the mother who had nearly been lost bringing her into the world. Grace's difficult labor and the dangerous fever that followed left both Daniel and the doctor fearing for her life. For 3 days and nights, Daniel barely left her side, cooling her brow with damp cloths and praying with a fervor he hadn't felt since the day he buried his sister. When Grace finally opened her eyes, lucid and fever-free, Daniel wept with relief. "I thought I was going to lose you," he admitted, holding her hand as if he might never let it go. "I had the strangest dream," Grace told him, her voice weak but clear. "I was walking in the hills and Rebecca was there. She took my hand and led me back, saying it wasn't my time yet. That you and the children needed me more than she did." Daniel didn't know if it had been merely a dream or something more significant, but he was grateful regardless. The thought that his sister might still be watching over them, guiding them when they strayed too close to danger, was a comfort he had come to accept rather than question. Little Rebecca, or Becky as they called her to distinguish her from her aunt, proved to be as spirited as her namesake. Where Thomas was thoughtful and methodical, Becky was impulsive and adventurous, always the first to climb a tree or investigate a strange noise. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes, and a laugh that could lighten the darkest mood. By the time Arizona achieved statehood in 1912, Daniel and Grace had been married for 35 years. The Callahan General Store had become Dawson and Sons Mercantile, with Thomas taking an increasingly active role in the business while his sister pursued her interest in medicine, becoming one of the first female doctors in Tucson. Life had not been without its sorrows. They had lost a third child, a boy, in infancy to pneumonia. Grace's arthritis made it difficult for her to work in the store as she once had. Daniel himself had suffered a heart attack at 60 that had slowed his pace considerably. But these trials had been balanced by Thomas's marriage to a schoolteacher named Sarah, the birth of grandchildren, Becky's successful medical practice, and the deep, abiding love between Daniel and Grace that had only strengthened with time. On a spring day in 1917, 40 years after Rebecca's death, Daniel made his way up the familiar path to her grave. At 68, the climb was harder than it once had been, but he still made the journey monthly, a promise kept through decades of changing circumstances. The headstone had weathered over the years, but the inscription remained legible. Daniel cleared away a few weeds that had sprouted at its base, then sat on the bench he had installed years ago to make these visits easier on aging joints. "Hello, Becca," he said, as he always did. "It's been a busy month. Thomas's boy, David, enlisted, heading to Europe for this war that's supposed to end all wars. Grace is worried sick, of course, but proud too. And Becky's opened a second clinic on the south side of town, treating mostly Mexican families who can't afford the hospital fees." He paused, looking out over Tucson spread below him. The town he had come to as a grieving brother was now a growing city, with automobiles sharing the streets with horses, electric lights beginning to replace gas lamps, and buildings of brick and concrete rising where adobe and wood had once stood. "I don't know if you can see all this, but I like to think you can. That you've been watching us all these years, seeing your niece and nephew grow up, meeting your great-nieces and nephews." He smiled at the thought. "I still don't quite understand what you meant that day about visiting together someday, but I think Grace was right. You were telling me that life would go on, that happiness was still possible, and it has been, Becca, it has been a good life." As Daniel sat in contemplation, he became aware of approaching footsteps. Looking up, he was surprised to see Grace making her way along the path. She rarely climbed the hill anymore, her joints too painful for the steep ascent. "Grace, what are you doing up here?" he asked, rising to meet her. She smiled, a bit breathlessly from the exertion. "I wanted to join you today. It felt important somehow." Daniel helped her to the bench, concerned by the pallor of her face. "You should have told me. I would have brought the wagon closer to the base of the hill." "And miss the walk through the desert in bloom?" "Never," she patted his hand. "Besides, I wanted to surprise you." They sat together in comfortable silence for a time, the breeze ruffling Grace's now silver hair. Below them, Tucson sprawled in the afternoon sun, a city transformed from the frontier town it had been when they first met. "You ever wonder," Grace said finally, "if this is what she saw, if this is the life Rebecca knew we would have together?" Daniel considered the question. "I don't know. I like to think she saw possibilities, like you once said, that she nudged us toward the best one." Grace leaned against his shoulder, her hand finding his with the ease of long familiarity. "I'm glad she did. These 40 years with you have been the greatest blessing of my life, Daniel Dawson." "And you have been mine, Grace Callahan Dawson." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Every single day." As they made their way carefully back down the hill, supporting each other as they had through decades of partnership, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path from that terrible day when he had buried his sister to this moment had been long and winding, marked by both sorrow and joy. But through it all, Rebecca's final message had served as both comfort and prophecy. "You'll visit together someday, just not yet." Not yet because there were still grandchildren to spoil, a business to guide into the next generation, quiet evenings on the porch to share. Not yet because the story they had begun together still had chapters to be written, memories to be made, love to be given and received. And someday, when the time finally came, Daniel believed that Rebecca would be waiting to welcome them, just as she had appeared to Grace in her fever dream, ready to guide them to whatever lay beyond. But for now, for this day, this moment they had each other, and that was enough. In 1922, on the 45th anniversary of Rebecca's death, Thomas and Becky arranged for a special gathering at the gravesite. Daniel, now 73, and Grace, 70, were driven up the hill in an automobile, a luxury that still amazed them both. They were joined by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, a family that had grown from the seed of that initial connection formed in grief. As they stood around the weathered headstone, Thomas spoke of the aunt he had never known but whose legacy had shaped his life nonetheless. Becky laid flowers from her own garden beside the grave, and the grandchildren took turns placing small stones on top of the headstone, tradition Daniel had begun years ago, a marker of remembrance that would endure longer than flowers. Grace, leaning on Daniel's arm for support, surveyed the gathering with tears in her eyes. "She would have loved this," she whispered to her husband. "All of us here together." "She does love it," Daniel replied with quiet certainty, "and somehow I think she's here with us now." As if in answer, a breeze swept through the gathering, carrying the scent of desert flowers and a whisper that might have been just the wind through the mesquite trees or something more. Daniel closed his eyes, imagining for a moment that he could feel his sister's presence among them, completing the circle of family that had begun with just the two of them, orphaned and alone. When they returned to their home that evening, Grace found an old daguerreotype of Rebecca that had been packed away for years. She placed it on the mantel beside their wedding portrait and the photographs of their children and grandchildren. "There," she said with satisfaction. "Now she's where she belongs, with family." Daniel wrapped his arms around his wife's still slender waist, resting his chin on her shoulder as they looked at the collection of images that told the story of their lives together. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For understanding how important she was to me, for making room for her in our life together, for giving our daughter her name." Grace turned in his embrace, her hazel eyes as clear and direct as they had been when she first offered him a job in her store all those years ago. "She brought us together, Daniel. How could I not honor that in the quiet of their home, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and well loved?" Daniel felt a peace that had been long in coming but was complete in its arrival. The young man who had buried his sister in the hills above Tucson, heartsick and alone, could never have imagined the richness that would grow from that barren soil of grief. Yet here it was a family, a legacy, a love that had endured through nearly half a century of joys and sorrows. Rebecca had been right, as she so often was. They would visit together someday, all of them, the family that had been and the family that had grown from it, but not yet. Not while there was still life to be lived and love to be shared in this world that had once seemed so empty, but now overflowed with blessings. And when that day finally came, Daniel knew with a certainty that transcended logic or proof that his sister would be waiting, ready to welcome them home with open arms and that knowing smile that had always suggested she understood more than she could say. Until then, he would continue to live each day with gratitude, to love Grace with the same devotion he had pledged on their wedding day, and to share the wisdom gained through loss and recovery with those who would carry their story forward. That night, as Daniel drifted towards sleep with Grace's familiar warmth beside him, he thought he heard a whisper that might have been the wind, might have been memory, or might have been something else entirely. Not yet, Danny, but someday. He smiled in the darkness, at peace with both the promise and the delay. Someday, he agreed silently, but not yet, we still have living to do, and they did.